I never imagined the house I grew up in, a sprawling old mansion with ivy crawling up the brick walls, would become a stage for my own humiliation. My parents always called it our family home, though the deed said otherwise. When they moved Greg, the man they insisted was my future husband, into the guest wing without so much as asking me, it felt like the final trespass. They said I was selfish to question it, that a real man deserves to take charge now. But they never once checked the records. Every wall they strutted past belonged to me alone. Before we get into how it all unraveled, tell me, where are you watching this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments. If you want more true life stories about standing up to toxic family expectations, hit like and subscribe right now. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. I was 32 when everything started to tilt. My name is Rachel, and I'm an architect by training, though you'd never guess it from the way my parents treated me, like I was still a shy little girl trailing behind them in department stores. The house, the so-called family mansion, had come to me straight from my grandfather. He left it to me alone, which my mother pretended never happened. She'd tell anyone who asked that it was the house she'd raised her daughter in, glossing over the fact that she hadn't paid a cent toward it in years. I'd let them stay rent-free out of respect, guilt maybe. My parents had always struggled with money. My father blamed bad luck, my mother blamed everyone else. When I was a kid, I'd sit on the grand staircase and listen to them whisper about how the neighbors looked down on us. It never mattered to my grandfather. He loved that old place. The wide front porch, the carved oak banister, the way sunlight warmed the library floor. He taught me to see it as something alive, something worth protecting. After he passed, I'd had the deed transferred to my name. I was 25, too overwhelmed with grief to think about whether my parents resented it. Over time, I convinced myself it didn't matter. I had a good job. They needed somewhere to feel important. If calling my house theirs gave them a shred of security, I could tolerate it. But lately, their entitlement had started to curdle into something uglier. They spoke about the property as though it was their legacy to shape however they wished. My mother said things like, "When you finally settle down, it'll feel complete here." My father joked about converting part of the attic into a studio apartment for family expansions. I tried not to dwell on it. I told myself it was harmless. But deep down, I felt it, the slow erosion of my boundaries. Every time I walked through the front door, I reminded myself, my name is on every document. My signature built this safety net they refused to acknowledge. Even so, I didn't expect the moment they decide to push me out of my own life would come so soon or so brazenly. Greg arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. My parents introduced him like he was some minor celebrity, a guest of honor they'd been grooming me to accept. He stepped into the foyer carrying a leather duffel bag and wearing a grin that made my skin crawl. My mother launched into her practice script, gushing about how ambitious he was, how he'll be such a stabilizing force for you, Rachel. She even threw in a line about how a real man deserves to take charge now. I don't remember inviting him to stay. In fact, I know I didn't. But my father brushed aside my confusion, clapping Greg on the shoulder and saying, "We've all agreed this will be the best arrangement for everyone." Everyone but me, apparently. Greg wasted no time making himself comfortable. Within the hour, he was touring the house like he already owned it. He lingered in the sunroom, tapping the old window frames and remarking that the stained glass would have to go. He inspected the kitchen as though he were assessing an investment property. He asked me what kind of mortgage I was carrying, assuming that the burden must be immense. I didn't correct him. Not yet. Over dinner, my parents piled praise on Greg so thick it was almost absurd. They talked about how responsible he was, how he was the kind of man who could manage a household. He responded with a tight-lipped smile, as if he'd just been awarded a trophy. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, fighting the rising burn in my throat. I kept wondering if this was a prank. Maybe any minute they'd all start laughing and say, "Relax, Rachel, of course he's not moving in." But nobody laughed. That evening, my mother pulled me aside in the hallway. "Don't embarrass us," she said in a brittle whisper. "This is the next step for you. You should be grateful." Grateful. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood frozen as Greg hauled his boxes through the front door, into my house, under my roof, where he would sleep, eat, and decide what belonged here. My father shot me a look over Greg's shoulder, a look that said, "Don't you dare make this difficult." I didn't say a word. But as Greg disappeared up the stairs, my pulse was pounding so hard it blurred my vision. I knew then this was no temporary arrangement. This was a takeover. The first week of Greg living in the house felt like a slow-motion burglary. He started in small ways, moving my things out of shared spaces as though he were tidying up, but each act was an eviction in miniature. The quilt my grandfather gave me ended up stuffed in a plastic bin. My books disappeared from the living room shelves. My favorite armchair, the one I used to sit in with coffee and a sketch pad, was shunted into the hallway until we figure out a better spot. Greg never asked permission. He didn't even pretend to care what I thought. He'd leave his gym bag in the front foyer, his keys on the kitchen counter. His shoes trailed dirt up the staircase I used to polish with my grandfather. He treated the place like an entitlement he'd finally claimed. My parents encouraged it. My mother fluttered around him like a hostess at her own private gala. She beamed when he complimented the size of the rooms, or when he declared he would modernize some of the clutter. My father joked that maybe Greg could handle the maintenance I had never bothered with. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it would pass. But every day, something else was rearranged, boxed up, or quietly removed. One night, Greg brought over 2 of his friends to watch football. I came home late from a project meeting, exhausted, and found all 3 of them sprawled across my living room, pizza boxes and beer bottles littering the coffee table I'd refinished myself. When I asked Greg if he could please clean up afterward, he looked at me with the same bland condescension he used when explaining how a thermostat worked. "We'll get to it. You don't have to fuss." Like I was the guest, like I was intruding. A few days later, it got worse. We were in the kitchen, Greg leaning against the counter, my parents pretending to busy themselves with the mail. And Greg said it again. "This is our place now," he said casually as if stating a fact. "Our place." My mother glanced over and caught my expression. She didn't apologize, she didn't correct him. She only sighed and said, "You've never known how to appreciate what you have, Rachel." I think that was the moment I stopped feeling guilty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying every little humiliation, every snide comment, every time they told me to be quiet. I knew I was being erased, one piece of furniture at a time. At 3 a.m, I got up, patted down the hallway, and climbed into the attic. I pulled out a battered cardboard box. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was the original deed my grandfather had signed. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the edges with my palm. My name, my signature, my house. And as the wind rattled the eaves overhead, I promised myself, this ends soon. Greg's sense of ownership over my home didn't plateau. It grew bolder by the day, like he was testing how far he could push before I snapped. When he announced he would be moving into my grandfather's study, it felt like a final insult I couldn't swallow. The study was the one place I still felt safe. It held everything I loved, blueprints from my first job, my grandfather's worn leather chair, the smell of old cedar and ink. I was standing in the doorway, gripping the frame so hard my knuckles went white, while Greg measured the walls for his new office. My mother hovered behind him, beaming as though this was a milestone in our supposed life together. When I finally found my voice and said, "You can't just take this room," Greg didn't even look up from his measuring tape. He said, "It makes the most sense. You don't use it properly." As if my memories, my career, my grief, none of it counted. My father stepped in, his expression pinched with exasperation. "Don't be selfish," he said. "This is better used as an office for a man with a future." I felt something in me split clean in half. I spent that afternoon packing away my grandfather's things while Greg stood in the doorway, offering helpful suggestions. He said the desk was outdated, the shelves were cluttered. Maybe he'd tear out the old built-ins and install something more streamlined. He tried to kiss me once, when my mother ducked into the kitchen. He leaned in, and I flinched so hard my shoulder smacked the cabinet. He looked offended, like I'd embarrassed him. "You'll come around," he said with that thin smile. "You're just nervous." I wanted to scream, to throw him out by the collar of his stupid suit jacket. But my mother came back in, arms folded, her voice dripping with scorn. "Stop being ungrateful," she hissed. "He's trying." Ungrateful. That word again. I spent the evening alone in my bedroom, the door locked. Downstairs, I could hear Greg laughing with my parents over takeout containers. Every so often, my father would say something low and pleased, and my mother would laugh. I thought about how small they'd always tried to make me feel, how I'd been the one to pay the taxes, fix the roof, cover the heating bills, and still they pretended I was some burden. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. At midnight, I crept back up to the attic. I set the deed on my lap and traced my name over and over with my fingertip. They were never going to leave on their own. I woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity so sharp it almost hurt. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't fogged with guilt or second-guessing. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first call I made was to my lawyer, Miss Alvarez, a meticulous woman with a voice as precise as a scalpel. She pulled up the records and confirmed what I already knew. The house was mine, and nobody else had any legal claim to it. "You have every right," she said calmly. "If you'd like, I can prepare formal notices immediately." I thanked her and hung up, my hands trembling. That afternoon, I began documenting everything. I walked through every room with my phone, snapping photos of Greg's belongings, the boxes piled in the hall, the changes he'd made without permission. I recorded the conversations when he and my parents lectured me about the future. It felt surreal, like building a case against strangers, except they weren't strangers. They were the people who had raised me, the people who were supposed to protect me. Some evenings, I still felt the old guilt flicker through my chest. Was I really about to evict my own parents? Was I as selfish as they claimed? But each time the doubt surfaced, I remembered my grandfather's voice. "A house is just wood and stone, but your dignity is yours to keep." At work, I finally confided in my friend Monica. We were sitting in the break room with vending machine coffee when I told her everything. She didn't try to soften it or make excuses. She just looked me in the eye and said, "You don't owe them your peace." I held on to those words like a rope. Over the next week, I rented a small storage unit across town. Every day after work, I packed up the things that mattered most. Family photos, my grandfather's blueprints, the quilts, the old records we used to listen to together. I wanted them safe, away from whatever fallout was coming. Meanwhile, Greg kept expanding his territory. He started referring to the kitchen as my kitchen. He began hinting that he'd handle the bills soon enough. My parents treated every boundary I set as a childish tantrum. But I was done explaining myself. One evening, after they'd all gone to bed, I sat alone in the study, my study, and prepared the eviction notices. I stacked them neatly on the old desk, weighed them down with a brass paperweight shaped like a lion. I pressed my palms flat on the cool wood and whispered, "This ends now." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. They thought I was weak because I'd been quiet. They had no idea who I was. The confrontation started the way all the worst moments in my life seemed to start. Early on a Saturday morning, with Greg thinking he had the final say. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when he came in, jingling a set of unfamiliar keys. He didn't even bother with small talk. He just announced, in that flat, patronizing voice, "I've scheduled a locksmith to come by this afternoon. It's time we upgraded security. You'll get a spare key, of course." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The audacity of it rooted me to the spot. Then something inside me snapped. "No," I said, my voice so steady it surprised me. "You're not changing the locks. This is my house." Greg smirked, as if I'd told a harmless lie. "Rachel, don't be dramatic. It's better if we think ahead. You'll see this is for the best." I set my mug down carefully. "Get out of my study," I said. He frowned, confused. "Excuse me?" My father came in, alarmed by the noise. My mother appeared behind him, eyes wide and wary. I didn't back down. I repeated, "Get out of my study. All of you. Sit in the dining room. We're going to settle this now." Greg started to argue, but I raised a hand so sharply he went silent. I'd never done that before, never once stood there and refused to be dismissed. They trailed me into the dining room, muttering and shifting like children caught sneaking candy. I laid the eviction notices on the table, 3 thick envelopes lined up like evidence. My mother actually laughed, a brittle, forced sound. What is this supposed to be? Some little performance? I didn't answer her. Instead, I set the original deed beside the envelopes. I unfolded it, smoothing the paper so they could all read it without pretending they didn't see. My father's face drained of color. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Greg looked from me to the deed and back again, as if he couldn't process what he was seeing. I read the clause aloud, my voice ringing in the quiet. This property, situated at 73 Willow Lane, is wholly owned by Rachel Lynn Moore, and no other party holds any claim or interest therein. Greg started yelling then, ranting about all the time he'd wasted, all the plans he'd made. My father tried to shame me, demanded to know what people would think when they found out I'd turned on my own family. I let them talk until the room was buzzing with their outrage. Then I looked at them, one by one, and said the words I'd rehearsed in my head every night for weeks. You have 30 days to leave? All of you. Silence fell so hard I felt it in my bones. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't say another word. My father stared at the deed like he could will it to disappear. Greg clenched his jaw so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. I picked up the envelopes and handed them out, one by one. And for the first time since this all began, I felt like the rightful owner of my own life. I walked back into the study and closed the door behind me, locking it with a quiet click. It was mine, again. All of it. In the days that followed, the mansion felt suspended in a strange hush. My parents barely looked at me when we passed in the hall. Greg packed his things in tense, resentful silence, every slam of a box echoing like a warning shot. I expected confrontation, another explosion of insults or pleas, but instead, I got something colder. My mother retreated behind her phone, sending me clipped text messages about logistics and how disappointed she was. My father spent most of his time shut in the guest room, emerging only to shuffle out to the porch with a cigarette. Greg was the first to leave. He didn't bother with a goodbye. One afternoon, I came home to find his car gone and his key on the kitchen counter. A small mercy. The rest of the month passed in a slow, heavy blur. The neighbors, of course, noticed everything. More than once, I'd catch someone on the sidewalk, pausing to stare up at the house, eyes wide with speculation. I wondered what stories they were inventing behind closed doors. Each evening, I walked the rooms alone, reclaiming them by degrees. In the library, I set my books back in order. In the study, I placed my grandfather's chair exactly where it belonged. In the sunroom, I unboxed the old records and stacked them on the shelf. And all the while, my parents continued to pack. The only words my mother said to me in person were, "I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. On the last morning, I stood in the driveway as they loaded the last of their things into a borrowed van. My father refused to meet my eyes. My mother paused on the porch, her hand resting on the column like she wanted to stake some final claim. But she didn't say anything more. They drove away without a backward glance. Inside, the house felt almost too big, too quiet. But the silence didn't scare me. It felt honest, like the house was breathing again after years of being suffocated by other people's expectations. That evening, I carried the last abandoned box up to the attic. Inside were old photographs labeled "Our House" in my mother's handwriting. I set it on a high shelf where it couldn't haunt me. I walked back through every room, my palms brushing the walls, feeling the shape of my life returning to me. In the sunroom, the late light fell across the floor in golden stripes, exactly the way I remembered it when I was a child. For the first time since Greg arrived, I sat in my grandfather's chair without feeling like an intruder. I closed my eyes and exhaled. They were gone. And I was still here. Weeks passed, and the house slowly came back to life. I started small, patching the dings Greg had left in the doorframes, repainting the scuffed walls in the study. It felt like tending a wound. Every brushstroke, every nail tapped into place was a reminder. I had chosen myself. Some days, the old guilt tugged at me, but it never lasted long. Each time I walked into the sunroom and saw the deed tacked to the corkboard, my name in bold letters across the top. That was all the reassurance I needed. Monica came over one Saturday with takeout and a cheap bottle of sparkling wine. We sat on the porch steps, paper cartons balanced on our knees, watching the neighborhood go about its day. "To freedom," she said, lifting her cup. "To peace," I answered. The neighbors stopped whispering eventually. Maybe they realized I wasn't going to vanish under the weight of their opinions. Or maybe they'd found something else to gossip about. Either way, I no longer cared. One afternoon, I planted a rose bush in the front yard, a small gesture my grandfather had always talked about but never managed to do. The soil was stubborn, but when I finally stepped back, I felt something settle in my chest, like the house and I were both ready to start again. I spent more evenings in the library, reading in the golden lamplight, no longer worrying about who might walk in to criticize. On rainy mornings, I brewed coffee in the kitchen Greg once claimed as his, and watched the ivy sway against the windows. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about how close I'd come to letting them all erase me, how easy it would have been to keep shrinking, to keep apologizing for existing. But every wall, every floorboard, every brick still had my name. I hadn't been selfish. I'd been surviving. And finally, I was living. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up to people who tried to take over what was yours? Share your experience in the comments. And if this resonated with you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here, and I wish you all the courage to claim your own space too.